All right, good to see everybody this morning. We are still in Genesis chapter 6. We're finishing it up this morning. So please turn to Genesis chapter 6. And just before class, I did put out a new sheet on the back table that gets us into chapter 7. So we have a couple of lessons designated for chapter 7 and chapter 8. So if you want to grab a copy of that now, you are welcome to, or if you want to wait until after class. But next week, we'll be looking at the first part of chapter 7 of Genesis. So if you want to grab a copy of those notes sometime before next week and study that over, and we'll be in chapter 7 and chapter 8. That's sort of one big package story for us. Today, we are finishing up the two questions remaining from our notes on chapter 6. We did not get a chance to finish those. We've spent 2 weeks on the issue of authority in the first question. And so today we're going to finish up chapter 6 with hopefully a look at some things that we didn't get to cover under the first question. All right, Bobby's got a handful of the notes. If you need a copy of those extra notes, you can raise your hand and he'll hand you one of those, as many as he might have. While doing that, just by way of preview, in chapter 7, we've got a couple of questions. One of those is, of course, it is a somewhat speculation on our part. Some of it we know for a fact, just based on some of what the Bible tells us. But the second question deals with what we know about the world prior to the flood and after the flood. And the question is phrased in such a way as to get us to think about the kind of catastrophic effect the flood had on the world of Noah. When Noah went into the ark, and he came out of the ark, the world that he went into the ark with and the world he entered coming out of the ark were two different worlds. They were very radically changed, and we want to try to think about how the world changed because of the flood. And chapter 7 deals with that largely. When you have the cleaving open of the earth and the great windows of the heavens being opened up and flooding the earth. Lots of changes topographically and geographically changed to the world. We want to talk about that. So that's something to look forward to. And another thing we're going to talk about, if you're reading ahead, is in verses 2 and 3 of chapter 7, God will then say, I want 7 each of clean animals, and then the pair of the unclean animals, and that seems different than what we read before. So we're going to try to figure out why God would now require more of the clean animals than of the unclean animals. And there was a hint later in chapter 8 why that would be the case. Thank you, Bobby. Okay, question number 2 under our notes on chapter 6, right? Here's the question. It's based on verse 18. Why do you think Genesis chapter 6, verse 18 is so important to understanding the life of Noah? Does God build motivations into his commands? And if so, what were the motivations for Noah? And what could we learn from this? What implications could we gather from that about Noah as a husband and a father? So let's read the verse, and then we'll open it up for some discussion. Here's the verse. God says to Noah, but I will establish my covenant with you, and you shall go into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, and your sons' wives with you. Okay, so he's speaking about the 8 folks that would go into the ark. What's that tell us about Noah? Why is this so important? Especially when God uses the word covenant. Why is that important? What's it tell us about Noah's place in history? What about motivations in the commands of God? Any part of that you want to tackle? Any thoughts, Bobby?
Much like the covenant he made with Abraham. I am making a deal with you and your family.
Okay.
Your religious beliefs. You're
Okay.
following what I say. As long as you continue to do that, I will make this covenant with you. As
Yeah.
he made
Yeah, so God made covenants with certain key figures. Noah is one of those, and it's a lot like the covenant that he would make with Abraham. So I think that's a good point. Gloria, I saw your hand.
Family was important, and the motivation of being able to have his family part of that covenant.
Yeah, I think it tells us a lot about Noah as a husband and a father, because he's motivated to do something for his family, and he's gonna save them. I want to explore that idea in just a moment. I think that's a great idea. Art.
Well, you know, the next verse also links in as part of the covenant with the animals.
Yes.
You know, and of course later on we know along with the covenant we know he's going to establish a rainbow.
Yep.
And
That's right.
he's lived by that even today, right?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, there are promises made, and kind of like Wednesday evening we talked about, some promises are conditional, some are not, and God establishes a covenant with the world that's absolute. I will never destroy the world with a flood of water again. So we have that coming up at the end of chapter 8, the beginning of chapter 9. We'll definitely talk about that. Think about this in terms of what happened early in the Bible. When God says in verse 18, I will establish my covenant with you. All right, so part of this is to save Noah from the floodwaters. But is there a much deeper, a much larger connection to something else going on?
That's the way the world would be appropriated, or whatever the word is.
Okay, yeah, so Noah would certainly be the progenitor and his family of everything else that would come after. Is there something that is the undercurrent in the Bible that is we're just never disconnected from that, Tommy?
I mean, it's through him that we'll get the son of it.
Okay, so if the world is destroyed, right, if the world is destroyed, save, verse 18, you, your wife, your sons' wives with you. If the world is destroyed, from whom does God fulfill his promise back in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15? Where's it come from? It's through Noah. And so we can never forget that in all of this, while it is certainly about the destruction of the physical universe and he's going to wipe away the evil in the world, God is still preserving his seed line through Noah and through his sons, and specifically one of those that we'll talk about at the end of chapter 9. Obviously, that seed line would be continued through the line of men leading to Christ, like Tommy was saying. And by the time we get to Matthew chapter 1, verse 1, these are the generations of Abraham, the son of, or Jesus Christ, the son of Abraham, the son of David. We've never forgotten that throughout history, God has always been directing the fulfillment of this promise. In Galatians 4 and verse 4, the Bible tells us that in the fullness of times, God sent forth his Son. There's never been a moment in history where God ever forgot the seed promise. Everything is connected to that. And so in verse 18, when God says to Noah, I'm going to establish my covenant with you, it's much deeper than I'm just going to physically save your life. God is saving the life of Noah so that he can fulfill the promise of his son. So if Noah and his family was saved and the world was destroyed, somebody would have to be responsible for carrying on and preserving the seed promise, and that's Noah. This is the first time in the Bible we see the word covenant. And that's a really important word in Scripture. What is a covenant? Contract, a promise. Any other thoughts? Both of those are really great ideas. A charge? Yeah. Some sort of directive, something like that. So we've had a contract, a promise, a pledge, a charge of some sort. Any other thoughts on what a covenant is? What is it? Okay, an agreement between two parties. Anything else? All of those are really great ideas. It is just exactly that. It is a pledge. Some might translate it an ordinance, but it's really both of those things together. It's a promise with some sort of an agreement involved in it. So a covenant is essentially a promise, a pledge, but sometimes, and like on this occasion, with some type of an agreement or an ordinance or a charge attached to it. Now, there are different types of those. We're going to talk about those real quick. Art?
Well, you touched on it already, but a covenant is two sides.
Yes.
You know, and God made a promise, he said, there's conditions always attached to it.
Yeah. So there's a couple of different kinds, and Art was saying that you have two sides, right? There's two people involved in a covenant. God is one, man is the other in any covenant. In the ancient Near East, there are several different types beyond it, but there's two basic types of a covenant. One was called a parity treaty. And this is where you have two equal sides, two equal parties who make an arrangement together. It'd be like if Toby was selling a camper, and I said, Toby, I want to buy your camper. And I go over and I look at it and I say, well, how about this? And he goes, well, how about that? And we barter until we reach an agreed price. Both of us are equal parties in that arrangement. Okay? So there were such things as that. If you're going to buy a piece of land, Lisa's selling a piece of land and I want to buy a piece of land from Lisa, we have to both agree. And so there's equal power behind both of those parties. That's a parity treaty when you have agreed upon terms by equal parties. There's another kind of covenant, of pledge, that's known as a suzerainty treaty, and the root word right in the middle of that is the word reign, and these were the types of covenants or pledges made by vassal lords or people in authority where they would just tell somebody what the conditions were. Of the two types, what is it that we have with God? Are we bartering with God and Him coming to our terms on things? No. It's more like a suzerainty treaty where God is telling us what the conditions are for something. He is supplying the conditions of His pledge, and so it is with God. Now, again, the immediate connection is with the flood, right? The deliverance of Noah from the flood and to save his family. But there's also a much deeper connection, which is to the seed promise. Now, Gloria hinted at it. I'm going to work our way toward talking about what this would mean as a father and as a husband. But let's talk about this concept of motivation. In verse 18, when he says, I'm going to establish my covenant with you, you go into the ark, you, your sons, your wife, your sons' wives with you, and, he talks about the animal, verses 19 and 20, and about taking the food, and Noah did everything, verse 22. Does God build, even though He is the supplier of the conditions, right? Even though God says these are the conditions that you're going to live by if you want to be saved, does God build motivations into His commands? Is it okay? Is it okay when we are responding to God that we respond based on the motivations He's built into the commands? And it isn't out of just paralyzing fear, right? We don't serve God out of paralyzing fear, but, when He says, be faithful until the end of your life, even if it costs you your life, and I'll give you a crown of life. Is it okay to want the crown of life? It's a motivation God builds into the command. Hold your place with me and go to 1 John chapter 5. 1 John chapter 5. 1 John chapter 5. Look at verse 3. 1 John chapter 5, verse 3. For this is the love of God, that we keep His commandments. And notice how he explains it so that it's, because some people would balk at that and they say, whoa, commandment keeping. Well, look at the end of this. And His commandments are not burdensome. Why aren't they burdensome? What is it? I heard lots of stuff. Why isn't it? Okay. Is it to our benefit that God tells us what He tells us? So he makes the commands. He tells us what to do. I have no bargaining power with God. I can't sit down and be God's counselor, and I can't make an agreement with God and say, if you'll only require baptism, then I'll do this. That's not how it works. God says these are the conditions, right? This is what you do. But at the end of that, He's always giving me a better life at the end of that. He's always got my best interest in mind to do that. So His commandments are never burdensome because I know that He wants the best for me to do that. Any other reason? Tom, I see your hand up.
Well, in the Old Testament, the commands, a lot of word words, but in the New Testament, it has become less words.
Yeah, I think a lot of that was people misunderstood. They probably abused some of the Old Testament commands because the commandments of God in and of themselves are never burdensome. But I do agree that there was some abuse of that led to a burden being placed upon the people. But and now we certainly have the Christ who explains the full end of everything. But yeah, it just. But part of it is the motivation that God builds into the command itself, that there's some reward. And conditions always vary to the consequences, right? The consequences are always per the command, whatever the command is be. Like Hebrews 5, verses 8 and 9, He's the author of eternal life to those that obey Him. So if I obey Him, the end of that is eternal life for me. Steve?
I'm always going back to John 17, when Jesus prayed, and He addressed Him as, "O righteous Father." And I can't help but place to add in His judgment toward His covenants. They're not overbearing.
Yeah, He's always fair. He always does what's right for us. So He's always equitable and fair in His dealings with men. So for example, if I'm reading Mark 16:16, which is for everybody, he that believes and is baptized shall be saved, there's a lot of comfort and hope in that because I know if I do that, if I complete His conditions, the end of that is salvation for me. I get my sins washed away. Matthew 11:28 through 30, come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, I'll give you rest. So He's got motivation built into that. Now, again, consequences can vary based on the conditions because, for example, in Luke 13, He'll say, repent or perish. Right? So there's a harsh consequence to that condition. But Noah is escaping destruction. And so God said, build an ark and I'm going to save your family. So it's not wrong for Noah to desire the end or the motivation that God built into that. So if you're still in 1 John, you're not far from it. Go to Hebrews chapter 11. And I want to talk about this for just a few minutes because I think it's important to understand Noah as a person, to understand him as a person. Hebrews chapter 11. And then after that, we can go back to chapter 6. Look at verse 7. By faith, Noah, being divinely warned of things not yet seen, right? So that'd be the rain. It had never rained upon the earth before. Moved with godly fear. So we've talked about in a prior lesson his motivation. That's his reverence for God, his deep respect for God. Prepared an ark. And here comes what I want to talk about. For the saving of his house. What God promised to Noah in that covenant He made with Noah to save Noah, was that a motivation for Noah that was connected to him as a father and as a husband? It was definitely connected to that because he saved his family. And what Noah did, he did to protect his wife and his children and his daughters-in-laws. So there's something to be said about the man as a husband and as a father. To look at him as a parent, I can do that because I can understand his motivations. And to see him as a husband, I can do that because I can understand his motivation. He wanted to save Mrs. Noah, and he wanted to save Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and the wives of those three sons. So with that said, you can turn back to Genesis chapter 6, and we're just kind of hang out. There's about 5 lessons we would like to observe about Noah as a husband, but especially I'm thinking in terms of being a parent because he saved his children as well. and you can apply it across the board to wives, and wives to husbands, and parents to children. But here's lesson number one. From Noah, I learned from Noah that it is the job of people within the family to save their families. It's the job of parents to save their kids. It's the jobs of husbands. It's the job of husbands to save their wives. It's the job of the wife to save their husband. It's our job to save each other in our family. Now, of course, God is the one who does the saving. Of course He is. By grace are you saved through faith, and that not of yourself. Obviously, if there's any salvation, God is the one doing the salvation. But of all the people on the face of the planet, who has the most influence to save a particular person? Family does. Your family does. So of all the people on the face of the planet, no one has greater leverage or influence on anybody else than a family does that. And especially in the early years, parents have more influence than anybody and more leverage and influence to save their kids. And no one has more influence on a husband than a wife. And nobody has more influence on the wife than the husband. And so it's the job of husbands and wives and parents to save each other. In Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 7, the Bible tells us that Noah saved his family. And I wonder sometimes if that's what we're doing today. I wonder if those are our marching orders today to save our family. I've said it before, and I hope you know that if there's a group of a couple hundred people that I could just say for sure I want these people going to heaven, it'd be obviously North Hamilton. I want everybody here to go to heaven, but I'm not going to lie to you when I tell you if out of all the people on the face of the earth, it's the people in my family I want to go to heaven. I really want my family to go to heaven. And so all of us ought to feel that way because we have the most influence over them. And I don't know sometimes that we're all acting like Noah in Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 7, because if my children are not doing the right thing and I'm not trying to talk to my kids about going to heaven, I don't know how I'm helping them. There's always the verse in my mind, Matthew 16:26, if you gain the whole world and lose your own soul. And I wonder sometimes when I look around, right, and I'm not pointing fingers at anybody here. I'm just saying, I look at the world. I see the interest of parents. They want their kids, I'm speaking parents, children now. I see parents who want their kids to be really visibly successful. They want them to be really athletic and to be very involved in things. And, the kind of, there's a life of comfort where kids today have never seen any kind of struggle in their life at all, ever. They've had everything given to them. They don't know how to deal with problems in life. And I just wonder, are we really saving our kids? What are we doing? Noah saved his family. He was willing to make sacrifices for his family. And I think if anything, number one, it teaches us that Noah was a person who was really interested in his family going to heaven, to being saved. And that's our job. Here's number two. Number two, based on this, I learned that you can do the right thing even when the whole world is doing the wrong thing, right? You can do the right thing even when everybody else is doing the wrong thing. We haven't talked about it a great deal, but I don't know if you've ever given thought to the population of the world at the time that the flood came. There are low estimates that in the low estimates, there are people who say, well, if we estimate the population, we would put it around 750 million people. But the people who shoot for 750, 800 million people in the world, that's still a lot of people, don't get me wrong. They have not taken into consideration the extremely long ages of men and women prior to the flood. So if I start looking at the age of, Adam was 930 years old, or Methuselah was 969, and I look at these men who lived almost 1,000 years, and I look at the capacity of people in that long lifestyle for filling the earth, a more correct understanding of the population of the world would have been anywhere between 4 to 5 billion people in the world. 4 to 5 billion. And out of almost 4 or 5 billion people, which is not too far away from our current population, how many people were doing the right thing? 8 people. 8 folks. Right? That'd be like 6, 7. So if you take from Bobby and Cindy and you just go forward and you include Gail and Toby and Judy, and you got Becky and Eddie, and then you've got, Bobby and Cindy, and maybe add Kay or somebody to get the 8, and you look at that number of people, and you can say in the entire world of men and women, only these people are doing the right thing. It's staggering, but you know what it means? You can still do the right thing even when everybody else is doing the wrong thing. That's what it means to us, because they did what was right. In Genesis chapter 7 and verse 1, we'll look at this hopefully next week when it says, the Lord said to Noah, come into the ark, you and all your household, because I've seen that you're righteous before me in this generation. They were the only 8 people doing the right thing in the whole wide world. In 1 Peter 3 and verse 20, the Bible tells us that only 8 souls were saved by water out of billions. That's tough. The kind of commitment to do the right thing, courage to do the right thing. It tells me a lot about Noah. This is a guy, he was not skipping out on talking about the Lord and working with his family to try to get him to heaven, because it's the only way you'd ever be able to do that. But I know that when my kids come in and they'll say something to the effect of, they'll say, well, everybody else is doing it, they don't make it right. And I know there was a time in the world when that was literally true, when the sons of Noah might have been able to come in and say, Dad, everybody else is doing it. And they were right about that. 8 souls in the whole wide world. You can do the right thing even if the world is doing wrong. I learned, number 3, that kids need a positive example of faithfulness before they will walk with God. It started with Noah. Noah was righteous, and he trained his kids to be, but kids don't get there unless they have that example in their parents. And so you start with Noah. Genesis chapter 6 and verse 9, he walked with God. Kids need that in order for them to be saved by their parents. I learned, number 4, that being a good parent looks different to God than it does to the world. I know the world tries desperately to tell us what parenting looks like, but being a good parent, being a good husband, or being a good wife looks a lot different to God than it does to the world, right? And the primary concern in any relationship ought to be, I want to save my family. I want my family to go to heaven. And I'm willing to do whatever I have to do to get my family to heaven. Number 5, and this had to start with Noah. It had to start with Noah and his wife. And that is that they taught their children to marry somebody that walks with God. Likely, depending on how many people were faithful at the... I know that 8 souls were faithful at the beginning, but at some point, those sons converted wives out of the world because the world was given to error. Because 8 means their wives were faithful too, and there were so few people to pick from. In Genesis 6, 1 and 2, the catalyst for the whole thing we talked about was people, the sons of God, marrying the daughters of men, and that was the restraint that would normally come within a godly home did not exist, and that's why the world spiraled out of control. But it's just super important to do that. All those things go into saving our family. So I think I can learn a lot about Noah. That as a man, he was not some sort of static figure who was just a laborer. He was very interested in getting his family to heaven and saving them from the flood. And that motivation was built into the covenant God gave to him. All right, with that said, in the remaining minutes, I want to talk about this. And I know that some of this is just, it's not written, but I think it's implied. Some of this is implied. And that's number 3. Noah did everything that God required. In Genesis 6 and verse 22, the Bible says, thus did Noah according to all God commanded him, so he did. All right, so there are obviously very specific requirements for the ark. There's also the generic commands to make or to build, which authorizes the means, expedients necessary to build the ark. And so the question now is, of all that we've covered in chapter 6, what qualities would Noah have possessed to accomplish such a task given by God, and what does this tell us about him as a person? Because again, he's not just some sort of, he's just a name in the Bible. He was a real person, and he had personality, and he had certain qualities. Do do we learn anything perhaps about his qualities from all the stuff that we've read in chapter 6? What do we learn about him? Do you think that if you looked up a pictorial dictionary of commitment, that his name would probably be there? I mean, the level of dedication and commitment to accomplish such a task, I think it was a completely committed person, Gloria was saying, to accomplish that. Because a lot of times, there are a lot of people today, they will start something, and they start out well, and then after a while into it, they're not running as well as they once did. I always think of the passage in, I think it's Galatians chapter 6 or chapter 5, where Paul says to the Galatians, he goes, "You did run well. Who hindered you that you should not obey the truth?" And the idea is, well, you made a really great start. You're just not finishing very well. Noah not only made a great start, he finished well. I mean, he stayed committed and dedicated to the whole thing. So I think he was committed. He was loyal. I think he was an extremely trustworthy person just based on the level of commitment he had. Any other qualities you think he had? Do you see him as a really intelligent person? I mean, I get that God provided the plans for the ark, but some of that's very generic, right? So outside of you need 3 stories, you need a window, you need a door, use gopher wood, pitch it inside, pitch it outside. Here's the dimensions of the ark. There's a lot of expediency on how the rest of it gets done. You've got to be really smart to get something like that done, and the kind of intelligence that would have been required on the part of Noah. And by the way, he's building an ark for floodwaters. Has he ever seen floodwaters before? Never. So there's sort of, it's not, there's sort of this wisdom that has to be part of what he's, through experiences in life where he foresees the potentiality of certain problems, and he's making that into the ark. So intelligent. He obviously must have been he's a student. He's a learner. He's a very intelligent man. Any other qualities? Yeah, brother.
Didn't it take an awful lot of faith?
Oh, yes. By faith, Noah, yeah. But there's no question.
But you have to remember, God didn't make Noah do these things. Noah chose.
Oh, absolutely. It's by choice that he did it. He certainly did, yeah. The building of the ark was up to him. All God provided him was the plan and the way to escape it, but you're exactly right. A great level of faith. There's no question that he was full of it. And he apparently, based on what we were just talking about, he apparently understood the need to share that with his family. So he was sharing his faith with his family. They were all working together to that end. Anything else? Yeah, brother?
I think he was a risk taker. He took on something that everybody in the world thought was complete food.
Yeah. Obviously, there's a sense as a risk taker, there's the faith component that comes into it. He's doing something based on something he's never seen before, but there's a trust that comes with God on that. But I think from the sense of incredible initiative, he was that way. And this faith is not blind. It's not a blind faith, but there has to be the ability to step out and do things based on what you know God is going to do on the end. And Noah was certainly willing to do that. So he was certainly that. Any other qualities you see in Noah as a man? Yeah. The kind of initiative and the creativity that was involved in that. I can see him probably as he's a word picture guy. He's working things out in his mind's eye before he puts it down on paper. And I think he's a planner. I think he would had to have been that way, because you're talking about a lot of time involved in the building of the ark. However much within that block of time from when God announces it to the end of it, however much time he spent making it, whether he spent 50 years making it or 60 or, however long, There's a lot of planning, great foresight. The Bible tells us about counting the cost. You don't start something before you do that. So there's a lot of pre-planning. Get the materials together. We've got to make sure we have the materials right before we do this. And it's not just taking timber and setting it up there. There's some planing of the wood, and there's certain curves that you'd want to on the corners and such. It just the intelligence and the creativity, his work ethic, his industry, unmatched. I mean, I would mark it down as a firm believer that Noah was not a lazy person. He was not a lazy person. He was a person who planned things out. He knew what he was going to do, when he was going to do that. Any other thoughts? No, he never deviated from what God told him. And the superseding quality was his faith. He never lost sight of what he was accomplishing and how much he understood about his place in history. I know he was saving his family, and however much God had revealed about what would happen in the future about the Lord and how much he could understand of that, if he didn't understand any of it, I don't know, but he stayed dedicated to the cause, that's for sure. He was a wonderful man. He's a person you would want, and we would want to be friends with in life, because he would be the kind of person who would motivate us to do better in every aspect of life. I want to be like Noah, and I really do want to be like Noah. Now, here's the thing at the end of that. Did God know the qualities of Noah? Yes, he did. And yes, sir. Oh, yes. Yes.
Chapter 1, verse 7, you've already quoted it. God finally realized his righteousness.
Yeah, Noah was certainly righteous, and the whole thing for Noah was not only was he a faithful man going in, but do you think at the end of it all that his faith was stronger at the end than it was at the beginning? I would think so. I know there's a problem in chapter 9, but I would think that his faith grows as a result of that. Does God see, just like he did with Noah, does God see our potential? Does God know our qualities? Will he use that for his benefit? And I think one of the best examples ever of that is in the apostleship. Like, God saw qualities some of those men didn't even know they had. And Jesus develops those qualities so that by the time he's ready to ascend back into heaven, they're ready for the task of preaching the gospel on the day of Pentecost and going all over the world and doing that. So God will take what we are and use it for his benefit. And he'll take what he sees within us that we don't even know is within us yet, and he can shape it and mold it and refine it and make us better in the process. Any other thoughts on this section for Noah? Yes, ma'am.
Just a thought. We're not told how often or what Noah talked to God about during all that time. I wonder how many times he talked to God about, well, how do I do this? Or what am I supposed to do?
Yeah.
That just comes to my mind.
Yeah, and I think you're bringing up a good point. We're not told, but I don't think it would be fair to say that the only time God ever talked to Noah was what we read about in verses 14 following. And for nearly a century, he didn't communicate with him and then comes back at the end and says, okay, now get in the ark. Especially in that day in patriarchy, when God talked to heads of households, and Noah was that, there is, I think, in chapter 3 of Genesis, when it says God was walking in the garden in the cool of the day, that there's this daily aspect of God walking with people. And can you imagine, like he walked with Enoch or like he walked with Noah, if that involved, and I think it did, I wouldn't be dogmatic about it, that as those men were going about life, God would come and communicate with those men. And there was a friendship, I think, with Noah and God. And one day we will realize this in heaven, but can you imagine the splendor, the overwhelming joy of just walking and God walking with you and you're talking with God? I think Noah did that. I think that was part of what was involved in him walking with God. So I think, Gloria, I think you're right. I don't think this was a one-time communication. God conversed with Noah. They had conversations. And that surely was a source of comfort for Noah as well. Yes, sir.
But don't we grow into certain qualities?
Yes.
As we're more
Oh, yes.
study
If we are willing, I'm convinced, if we are willing and we'll just follow God, we have the faith like you talked about earlier. God will take the things He sees in us that we may not even know that we have yet, these qualities that can be better than they are, and He'll refine them and He'll use them. He'll use them through us. I think so. All right, let's put a peg in it here. If you haven't grabbed a copy of the notes, please do, and take a look at those. We only have 2 questions for that first part of chapter 7, but there's a lot in those. We'll probably spend 1 week on that first verse because I want to get to that idea that Noah is doing something with these 7 clean animals. What's he doing with that? Why is that so important? It's really important, especially at the end of chapter 8. So we'll take a look at that next week. Thank you guys so much. Appreciate your input.